on this platform, but hey. Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. And it's a fun situation because I recorded a reconstruction book yesterday with a great author, and I have another reconstruction book today to talk about. It seems like it's Reconstruction Week for me here in North Germany. And today I thankfully don't have to bridge much of any time zone difference except for 1 hour, which is great. Makes things a lot easier to schedule. And I have David Ballantyne with me today. And he is a senior lecturer. We're operating in the British system, so I'm a professor here. Senior lecturer in American history at Keele University. And he has a PhD from Cambridge, so very smart individual. He has a number of publications, including a book, New Politics in the Old South, Ernest F. Hollings in the Civil Rights Era. And for some reason, which he will tell us in a minute all about, he decided to write a new book about Reconstruction, of all places, in Louisiana, which is Fractured Freedoms, Reconstructing Central Louisiana from LSU Press. So, David, thank you so much for joining. And I'm really looking forward to that origin story.
Thanks for having me on. Something like that, if you are interested. So I came at this project largely by chance. I was really interested, studying for my PhD in essentially civil rights or race and Southern US politics. And I came at it from my PhD project looking at a South Carolina Democrat called Fritz Hollings, who has made his name or somewhat national notoriety in the early 1960s for calling for the desegregation of Clemson College when he was leaving as governor. And then was a somewhat moderate Southern Democrat at a time when there were still plenty of reactionary Democrats around among the Southern Democratic Party. So coming from that, I very much by chance I joined up a postdoc at Leiden University in the Netherlands with Adam Fairclough was the sort of lead researcher there. He's done quite a bit of work on various aspects of civil rights and the American South, on teaching, and also on Louisiana civil rights. So he ended up writing a book on Natchitoches, Louisiana, so just up the river, slightly to the north and slightly to the west. And that era in Reconstruction, and had a colleague there as well called Mark DeVries, who also wrote, I think, an excellent PhD on sort of political violence in the Red River Valley. So I joined up there. It was very happy coincidence or happy set of circumstances for me. Leiden's a great place to work, and like some market culture and all the other good bits about spending some time in the Netherlands. And I think it certainly has echoes of the sort of 20th century debates, but maybe somewhat more stuck in the 19th century.
So now I have to ask, because I've lived in Louisiana, I know how weird these spellings and names are. I butcher all kind of British terms and names. So how long did it take you to figure out that it's Natchitoches and not any sick other?
I had it explained to me pretty quickly. I found the things I find interesting going there are I don't know if you have like the Natchitoches meat pies, which seem perhaps like empanadas, you might say. But really, really pretty place. But it was one of the first things I was told, actually, with the not getting the spellings wrong. But there's always a bit of a guesswork going on if you see like a French or a Spanish looking name as to whether you take a French accent to it or something completely different.
Yeah, I know. There's one town that looks like Iowa, but I don't remember how it's pronounced in southern Louisiana, but it's just crazy.
Well, I'm trying to look at Homer, I think HUMA, among others, or I guess you just need to talk to people as well as you can.
Yeah, that's when you let others introduce the city for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So since you're the second one in a series of reconstruction podcasts that I'm doing and conversations with authors, I'm kind of a couple of things that I want to continuously do in these conversations is sort of get a sense of the state of the field. So where do you see, especially having done the study with Louisiana, which has seen quite a bit of research. I mean, going back to reconstruction of the cane fields, obviously, and Fairclough has done some books on like the election of 1876. There we go. Almost got that one wrong. So there's quite a bit of work done on that. So where do you see sort of your book fitting into the trends within reconstruction?
Well, I see myself particularly, part of this sort of maybe like towards a new synthesis is like getting better awareness of how things look differently in different places. So one thing that I argue and I found in looking at Louisiana is that really like your experience of reconstruction can vary pretty significantly depending on which part of the state you're in, whether you're close to Union military support or not, whether the dominant crop where you're there is cotton or sugar or maybe a bit of both, or neither. There's a lot of sort of variations that hopefully by lots of these new works that really zooming in on that, you can come to a better understanding of like what's shaping the experience of really the experiences of Black freedom, how it looks similar and different in different places. In terms of Louisiana, I think moving away, not that New Orleans doesn't get attention now, but certainly paying attention to the other bits of the state, and especially as far as like political control of the state in Reconstruction, the Red River Valley, so essentially from the center of the state up to the northwest, had either near or Black majority populations that are like fairly close in terms of Black and white population numbers, so between like 50 and 70 or so percent African American in those places. So they're ones where there's really major disputes and really fraught battles over political control that then helps dictate the state itself. I'm certainly influenced by this relatively new scholarship, people like Gregory Downs and others who've looked at the role of the military in Reconstruction. So I've tried to bring that to my own work, and as well as people who bring in focusing especially on sort of gender and violence there. Well, one thing that I found particularly notable here is the sort of ongoing sort of intellectual arguments that opponents of Reconstruction make about trying to paint their opponents as being unmanly, cowardly, and also you start to see this sort of making up of this racialized. You may well have heard of the Black rapist myth, or as one of these key props of like Jim Crow society by the late 19th century. You're starting to see ways that this is being constructed in Louisiana by the 1870s. So I see myself like fitting into those areas, but particularly in hopefully one of these going local or being there with my magnifying glass, trying to understand more about what's happening on the local level that'll hopefully inform how we think about how Reconstruction evolves more broadly.
So, and I love that because so many of the studies these days have sort of that magnifying, like we're doing these community, regional studies aspects to Reconstruction. And as fun as that is, and as much as you can dive into the details, I think one of the challenges with that, and that's sort of my next question for you, is that we have these minute studies or minute details that are starting to appear, and how much does that fit into sort of the argumentative molds that we had with sort of like unfinished revolution or success and failure of Reconstruction, but then also how much does that make it hard to eventually write sort of a new grand narrative for Reconstruction?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes it more messy. I think like one thing by like looking in closely, I think you see maybe in like large outlines that many of the sort of major claims fit. But at the same time, I think I'm inclined to see quite a sort of more, if I say sort of messy and often pretty transactional politics at play. So, not just among certainly like white politicians in the region. Often, I think sort of shrinking down morality, and if in doubt, thinking about where the money is going can be quite a helpful guide here. I mean, I hope it then comes back to inform, a sense of how where things fit and where they don't. I think. I certainly think the idea of like unfinished revolution. You may see it as to sort of parrot one thing that for instance, stress a much more pessimistic process of reconstruction, seen as a failed revolution rather than one that is sort of partial and then is completed later. I think. I highlight there are, it's, I think, political control of African Americans in sort of civic politics and in central Louisiana is quite precarious in Louisiana, but it is, there are meaningful changes that, when you're starting from, most of the population, or most of the African American population having been enslaved, this toehold economically and building sort of social institutions, educational institutions. Those are significant gains, and they're not easily dislodged. So I certainly see that as fitting into its successes, even if trying to sort of balance the dual thoughts at the same time of this being an unstable settlement, but one where there are important and significant things happening.
Yeah, and I think one thing that you kind of implicitly notes there is that it very much depends sort of on our time when you're writing, because there's a lot more interest in Reconstruction. There's a lot more parallels that people might be able to draw with contemporary gerrymandering efforts to Reconstruction than even 10, 15 years ago. So that might have an impact as well to kind of think about like, okay, what does this, what meaning does Reconstruction have, and why should I learn more about it?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree. I think with the last 10 years, certainly, I think Supreme Court decisions in the last decade and a half or so, you are seeing more and more people looking at maybe you have like a second Reconstruction being the civil rights movement, and then sort of backtracking going on in terms of voting rights. And you can certainly draw like your parallels between like the contests over like who's a citizen, who has the right to vote, whose voices should be heard. Like, these are they are things that are being really fiercely contested in the 19th century, and they certainly have like contemporary resonance.
And the other parts that I kind of noticed, and you have it in your book, Robert Bland had it in his book yesterday as well, that it seems like we're really pushing on the chronology as well, and that Reconstruction is no longer this kind of weird 1865 to 1877 period. We've broadened it out, it feels like, into kind of much bigger frames.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think another part of this, stretching out Reconstruction, or like looking more broadly and more deeply in different places, is seeing if we see a key aspect of Reconstruction being about Black political economic freedoms, how they develop and how they are dismantled in different places as well. Like Black political power is kind of overturned in different times in different places, or with the Republican Party in Louisiana. So in Rapides Parish, where I focus a lot of my attention in this book, which is basically in the center of Louisiana, has a 60-ish% African American population. vastly smaller than New Orleans, but otherwise one of the larger parishes in Louisiana. There, the 1876 elections actually dislodged Republican control at the state level. You still return some Republican officials at the sort of local level. So it takes certainly until 1878. And then there are these in Louisiana. It is still fairly unstable for about another 2 decades, where you have in the later part of the book, I do look at, especially towards that populist political challenge. But there's this long-standing white political disunity where just because many white Southerners oppose the Republican Party doesn't necessarily mean they're happy Democrats. And you see lots of papering over the cracks of disunity at various times. But 1870s, 1880s, you certainly have these sort of more farmer-focused groups there. And although it is beaten back into the 1890s, there's major challenges to democratic political power in Louisiana. So that's where I try to trace it through, because as you suggest, or as you mentioned, these things, it's not a sort of binary having power, not having power, but these changes don't just disappear overnight.
And I kind of want to go back to where you said like the population is about 60% African American, and in many ways that sort of reminds me always of Michael Fitzgerald's study for Alabama, and how the more parity you have, the greater the chance of violence. So it seems like there's a certain similarities that we're seeing based on sort of what he suggested in other parts of the South, that the more you have sort of a 50-50 or 60-40 split, that violence tends to be stronger, whereas 90-10 not.
Yeah, I mean, I tried. You might see there are a couple of maps in the book.
Yes,
I tried to sort of map out populations and vote totals, so you hopefully get a better sense of where this sort of locally focused study fits into the sort of statewide picture. But I'm certainly like there we go. You're right on top of it there, but you can see. Yeah, certainly in going towards like the northwest of the state, so from like Rapides up to Caddo, up there, it's relatively evenly split, or in that sort of very slight black majority to somewhat significant, where the sort of political calculation is closer to if you stop a certain number of people voting, or you intimidate voters, or get them to vote for your party, then you'll likely be able to tip the scales and win elections there. Where the counter to that in Louisiana and along the Mississippi River, you have much higher black majorities. So in that region of sort of 80 and even higher percentage African American there, where you don't see as much political violence there, at least not for a long time. And into the northwest of the state, you also have. I'm sort of leaning on people like Gilles Van Daal here and others who've written about this here, but certainly in the Red River Valley is renowned as being particularly violent. It's a part of Louisiana that certainly up towards Shreveport, that part of the state isn't occupied during the Civil War. So there's this sense of being like unvanquished there. And also the further up the river you go, Rapides Parish is really like the furthest north that you get. So significant sugar cultivation there. One of the things with cultivating sugar before the Civil War is that it's very, it's extremely labor intensive and hard work, but also it helps to foster strong black political traditions that are pretty robust after the Civil War. You may well have spoken to John Rodrigue at some point. He's written extensively about this in southern Louisiana. So where am I going with this? Oh yes, the political calculation. Certainly, this closely divided parishes. Certainly, I think there's a lot more reason why you might have the incentive toward political violence there, where if it's 80 or 90% white, not as much need. If you suspect most white voters will end up voting Democratic, or at least won't vote Republican. And yeah, on the other side, where you've got a very heavy African American majority, it's not really feasible that way either.
No, exactly. I think that's sort of an interesting aspect of this situation that we have here in the in the Red River Valley, as sort of this plantation belt that is sort of touched by the war, but it's not majorly touched by the war, and sort of that it becomes even more as you go up, into northern Louisiana, the less touched it becomes by the war, the more you have sort of these memories of the war, of the northern evil invader that tries to impose its will on the country. And that sort of is where I found reading your book and Robert Bland's book in quick succession really interesting, because Robert takes the approach to kind of think about African Americans remembering Reconstruction. You're looking more at whites remembering Reconstruction, and sort of like it's the same thing, but widely different ways of remembering what took place.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly there's sort of, I say, sort of simplified war memory is a really sort of this sort of lost cause memory it begins almost immediately, I'd argue. Or certainly, I talk a lot about Eugene Biasa in this book, who's a Democratic politician has been a postmaster and then is a sort of party newspaper editor of this paper, the Louisiana Democrat, until he dies, almost until he dies. 15 years after the war. And there, almost immediately, you're making this case that really all the best people in the region supported the Confederacy, and it's only talk often about the dregs of society, or basically the traitors to the region who went against it. I think there's also, I mean, there are ways that the war is just fosters all these sort of animosities at a local level, where there are some committed unionists in places like central Louisiana, and you have the sort of low-level sort of guerrilla warfare going on between Unionists and Confederates. And when, in the case of Rapides Parish, so around Alexandria, which is a small town, but it certainly is one of the sort of more significant towns, outside of New Orleans, in Louisiana at the time. It's occupied twice, but only briefly during the Civil War. And when you get there, one of these really prominent post-war politicians, James Madison Wells, is from Rapides Parish. He later becomes governor of the state, but he seemingly takes the opportunity to try and partly sort of get one back over people who've been harassing him for much of the previous part of the war. And also, he claims, at least, that he makes all these very major sort of purchases of cotton and sugar and everything else with the Union Army coming up, and then claims for an enormous amount of it after the war as part of the Southern claim. But there's an example there where you're sort of having these sort of local disputes, and even if with the best will in the world, even like a brief occupation, it certainly is like damaging, and you definitely get a simplified version where I think this sort of white unionist memory. I think I want to say Clayton Butler has talked about this with his book True Blue, if I'm remembering correctly. Tendency, at least, for like not so much of that sort of white unionist memory to be especially prominent later, but there are these dissenters, and they tend to be sort of relegated to the sideline of like the dominant sort of white Southern accounts after the war. So it's people are more committed to the Confederacy after its defeat, arguably, in that way, where it's unsurprising during wartime that not everyone wants to get on the same page, and in many cases, people are really doing what's good for them personally or for them economically, rather than necessarily seeing a sort of grand sense of national attachment. So yeah, it's an interesting way that the war is sort of reused in the years afterwards to try and sort of bring about political unity.
But let me follow this up because obviously it's a parish over, but technically it was in the original rapid size parish was Colfax, the massacre, right? And yeah, like you have its own memory of that event kind of taking hold locally, and I'm also thinking like when I taught in the U.S. and kind of did memory and reconstruction, of course, New Orleans with the takedown of monuments comes up, and it kind of was a blurring of lines in at times because some of these monuments are like Battle of Liberty Place. Well, that's Reconstruction. Jefferson Davis Monument is Civil War, lost cause. So are we like, should we avoid conflating sort of lost cause and Reconstruction memory, or is it okay that we conflate them? Or should we keep them separate?
I would say I think many of the sort of lost cause creators, say, or people who like promote lost cause versions of history, Reconstruction I could see as a sort of key second act to this, or it is often tied together with sort of a unified noble cause that's only overcome through like overwhelming military force. But then also you could see Reconstruction as this this period of suffering and humiliation that then you're delivered through. This idea of like redemption and all the religious connotations with that. So I see them. I think people at the time, well, I say at the time, in the decades after Reconstruction, people, for instance, at Colfax, white paramilitaries who were involved in the killing there in the Colfax massacre. I'm trying to remember who exactly there, but there is talk of like the wars for Reconstruction as well, even though in terms of like the actual scale, the level of killing is it's shocking and appalling, but it's not of the scale that you see in the Civil War. But I think it's often presented together. One thing that people like Caroline Janney have written about is like certainly when you get into the 1920s, after World War One, increasingly people who are doing this memory making, their sort of formative memories are really of Reconstruction rather than the Civil War. So there's also a way that gets sort of a more sort of Reconstruction tinged lost cause story there. That's something I find particularly interesting, or I've written. I write about the Colfax massacre in here, and partly about how it's sort of retold and used for some democratic political ends. But elsewhere, sort of extending the story a bit further, I find it particularly interesting in how the sort of the general outlines of the story from the perspective of the white paramilitaries who won there stays more or less the same, but you kind of get different emphases over time. So in the early 1890s, for instance, there was a novel published which is not very fictionalized by a local white woman who's politically connected in central Louisiana. And there, like, she partly tells a story about the dangers of white political disunity. And it's in this sort of mold of Northerners coming down and realizing the white Southern view of race and politics is right. So there's that sort of sectional reconciliation, and I see it at least as like in the context of there being third party political challenges in the region at the time. So seeing this as a story for being part of the Democratic Party and having to stay with the Democrats, where by the 1920s, a tendency, these things aren't absolute, but I see more of a tendency to see this more in a sort of clearly about race, or not that race isn't prominent before, but very much the white Republicans largely are downplayed in favor of the apparent indignities of black political power in the period. And more of a focus on like carpetbaggers and this sort of external force rather than the sort of the Republicans coming from like within the South, or at least the white Republicans coming from there. But yeah, I think it's fascinating how these sorts of memories of Reconstruction are sort of made and then sort of subtly reshaped as you know, in different times.
Right. No, it's I mean, I kind of was. I have to admit, I was ignorant on this one. That you brought up Governor Nichols in your book, right? And the, let's just say, problematic activities that he engaged in. And I mean, we still have a Nichols State in the state as a state university, so it's sort of like the memories of some of these individuals are very much imprinted on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. I would say it is challenging, certainly. And if you're trying to judge people by their standards at that moment, Francis Nichols seemingly is more or sounds more conciliatory than many of his peers. Not that it matters much when it comes to Democrats back in political power from 1877. But yeah, there are all these challenges. One thing I found interesting coming to LSU, so Louisiana State University, to do a decent chunk of the research for this is seeing
I'm
where
sorry.
Sherman is. So William Sherman, Union General, shows up a bit in this book where he was the first superintendent of what later became LSU. And that was originally just outside of Alexandria where they had cadets, and it was a sort of military school and a state seminary. So a mixture of sort of academics and military training. And Sherman, again, it's those views don't especially age well, I think. So for all manners of reasons, I don't envy people who are naming. I'm sure by by standards of different areas, we're obviously working in our own sort of current context, and in 50 years, people will come back and see other things as being like problematic or concerning.
No, I was in Louisiana when they actually debated again naming a building after Sherman at LSU, and you got the real sense, pun intended, that hell would freeze over before that ever happened in the States. So
it's really challenging with because the Boyds, for instance, or David French Boyd being a sort of I think seen as like father LSU. He writes to Sherman a lot. It's one of these debates that's gone on in the UK as well around, say, like Edward Colston and who is unacceptable to commemorate. I don't have a particularly good answer to it.
Well, if we had, we would be in a different profession, right? So let's get into the weeds of the book a little bit too, because that's, after all, one of the important parts of why we're here today talking. And one of the things that I really found interesting, I kind of was curious about, because Eugene Bielsa really takes a prominent role in your book, because he's everywhere throughout it. And I kind of was like, is it just sort of accidental that you stumbled on him? Is it just because he just wrote a lot and that gave you a lot of faith to use him? Or, I mean, he's not the nicest of guys.
Yeah, he's an interesting character, I'd say. I think partly he's someone with like a loud microphone. So this is a editor of the Louisiana Democrat, which is the Democratic Party paper in Alexandria, and more or less every week for 15 years he's writing something. But he also, I mean, he has a series of like feuds with others in the town too. So James Madison Wells, who's this prominent wartime unionist and post-war Republican, has a dispute with Biosat over when the Union Army occupies Alexandria. There's a sort of special loyalty oath for Biosat where he has to, I think he's under house arrest effectively, if I remember correctly, but has to sign an oath to the Union of future loyalty. And it certainly rankles Biosat later on about that. But I think in large part he's almost like a proxy for what powerful democratic interests in the region are arguing for. Where you get a sense from some other letters from people like so Thomas More was a governor of Louisiana during the Civil War, also from Rapides Parish, and a series of other sort of pretty prominent sort of Democratic politicians. Where when he writes to, I want to say Thomas Manning, who is later is on the state Supreme Court, it's fairly apparent that Biosat is doing the bidding of what the Democratic local Democratic Party is particularly wanting pushed. But there's certainly elements of him alone where he seems to be the one with the editorial line there, but there are certainly these disputes at different times like during the war and after, whether he's necessarily following the right line there. And later on, where Biosat, as with other people, he shows up in court cases too because of charges for don't get the right term. I'm not sure if it would technically be embezzling, but certainly failing to pay back funds that were collected in a public capacity. And there, the people who are like providing bond for him again are this local political elite or local democratic political elite. So I think he's a helpful way of getting into all these things. He has some sibling or siblings. There's more than one Biosat around, but certainly Eugene is the one who's there most often in the book, and it's partly an accident of him writing a lot. And one of the challenges of books like this, I think, certainly this book, is trying to navigate that sort of imbalance of sources, where quite often in central Louisiana, where you do have Republican Party papers, but they don't have particularly big circulations at the time. You're less likely to have a full print run, where it would be really nice to be able to find all the issues that were published, but that I haven't managed. That maybe they exist somewhere and I don't know of them. But you have that challenge of like the fact that the majority of the population has far less of a microphone or a megaphone to sort of make their views known, or at least what's been archived since. Very much privileges the democratic line.
No, I mean, that's sort of a big challenge when you write even about the formerly enslaved, right? It's like there's silences that you're facing that are very difficult to overcome because they don't write. They appear in Democratic papers or in Republican papers by whites or in the Freedmen Bureau report, but of themselves they don't have a lot.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you get one benefit of Louisiana having a lot of contested elections in Reconstructing. You get a lot of congressional testimony, and even though, as far as I'm aware, the questioners tend to be white, you do get people's voices that way. But often it's filtered through another source. So if it's the Freedmen's Bureau, they might be reporting what someone has said to them, or often through the letters of planters complaining about their employees not doing what they want, or disputing the rations that they have, or leaving the plantation and so on. You normally get this sort of filtered view of African American activity generally, and the literacy challenge is there, where it's harder to recover things when you're not writing as much of it down.
And I guess the other part with that is that you also have instances where you can't really trust their words because you have these loyalty oaths takers in the course of the Red River campaign of '64, and you're really nicely raising the question of like, are they just doing it out of pragmatism because they want to keep trading? Are they like nationally loyal? Like, you can't trust necessarily their word of like, oh yeah, I'm loyal to the union.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
it's a funny one where I try to think of it almost like among this group. So when the Union Army occupies Alexandria in early 1864, so in March through May, there are about 900 or so people who sign these loyalty oaths, and 600 and something of them are, you can identify them as white men. So that's in the region, somewhere around like a half of the voting population from a previous election, or a not insignificant number of signers. Sometimes I think of it almost like if you're panning for gold. It maybe is a bad analogy, but in this bucket, you do have some sincere unionists who have been opposed wholly to secession, and maybe they have been involved in like guerrilla fighting against, or like total resistance to Confederacy. Then you have others who maybe opposed secession, but they're going along because it's dangerous to your life and property to be vocally opposed to something in a war, and others who are very much doing what works for me now. I think so. There are plenty, or there are enough examples anywhere where you see it being fairly clear that people are using this as a way where people have goods they want to be able to trade. One of the seamier sides of the Red River campaign in the Civil War is that it's partly promoted as a sort of opportunity to open up the region to trade. So you've got always cotton and sugar, and you're trying to bring it down the river to be able to sell. And so a decent number of people are taking that opportunity to trade. Others are just openly coerced into it. So I think people like Biossa, I'm fairly sure, one of the people singled out for being required to sign an oath, and a couple of James Madison Wells's enemies, effectively, are also sort of lined up as ones who should be required to take these oaths, and that includes at least one, Louis Tejada, for instance, and I think John Algie as well. But there were a few people who had been involved in secession, so the secession convention, Louisiana leaving the Union in 1861, who then sign oaths of future loyalty. But I think it's very much a sort of snapshot of how some people think the war's going in 1864, and then it quickly changes in this part of the country. But also, others, this idea of an oath, if it's taken under compulsion, not really standing for much or for anything. But it's a curious one where you get this sort of at least face value expression of loyalty that then quickly doesn't hold.
Yeah, and that sort of like leads to the other point that I was thinking about, because you have these shortages, that relief that needs to be provided to women, especially whose husbands are fighting outside the state, and the governors, wartime governors, Confederate, have to provide some stuff, but they're still remaining somewhat loyal to the Confederacy at the same time, and it's sort of like it shows Louisiana sort of like Confederate government doesn't really care about it, but the people need to be provided for.
Yeah, there are apologies. I think you're getting the tunes of Shania Twain from something rather
The students
loud.
are partying outside.
Yeah, the perfect setting for a chat. Certainly during the war, you get like poorer women, especially making these demands on government. It's something that is definitely McCurry has highlighted plenty in Confederate Reckoning, published a bit more than a decade ago, maybe a bit more than that. But you certainly get those cases of people like associating their loyalty or the fact that their children, their husbands, their siblings have been fighting, that they need provisions, they need help. And, there are efforts to sort of respond to that. I think certainly by the end of the war, it doesn't seem that central Louisiana is a place that you'd necessarily want to be going to have a nice meal and a good time. At least, some soldiers write fairly scathingly about the sort of sifting by early 1865. There are these certainly among poorer residents, sort of food shortage. Things are difficult, I'd say, but there are these sort of, as you were mentioning, these sort of new sets of demands and sort of claiming there need to be sort of some benefits of citizenship to go with the obligations of fighting.
Right. And fighting is the exact segue into the other part, because once the fighting stops, now the challenges come. Freedmen are having opportunities, but it is a volatile place and period. And I noticed it in Robert Blance's book, but you have it in other Reconstruction works, obviously, as well, that arming African Americans as well as providing military occupation, the Freedmen's Bureau having troops on the ground. I mean, it seems like it's really crucial to have some form of military presence for Reconstruction to bring sort of results that lead to a more inclusive political environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it as being pretty central, or not work that's original to me, but Henry Adams, who was a advocate of black emigration, later testifies in, I think, 1880 about how emancipation comes to Northwest Louisiana, where it is very much with troops, or is fiercely opposed. Having boots on the ground, you might say, is really important. In central Louisiana, there's an army chaplain called George Carruthers, who is briefly in Alexandria and then later in other areas in northeast Louisiana, who he writes about Alexandria as being the sort of calm presence in the sort of sea of disorder, where having a military occupation there it really helps. And one part of the challenges of the immediate post-war period is just lawlessness as well. So in the parishes to the north of Rapides, you do get some criminal gangs still operating for the next 5 or so years after the war. And there's a breakdown of order is certainly a problem. In terms of Freedmen's Bureau agents, some Freedmen's Bureau agents get murdered. So it really is, and others just see that they can't do their jobs. Or if you're trying to be an assistant to people who've been formerly enslaved and trying to ensure that they get fair conditions in selling their labor and aren't mistreated in various other ways. If you don't have any support, it's very hard to do. And so Carruthers, for instance, if I'm remembering correctly, he later resigns from a role as a Freedmen's Bureau agent because he just thought he couldn't do it, or didn't have the support in northeast Louisiana to do that, where having military backing is really important. You see occasional examples of in 1867, for instance, where there's a particularly obvious miscarriage of justice there, where having military presence there allows for the removal of recalcitrant office holders. That's quite poorly expressed, but the fact that you have military support there, it provides the backing that allows for some more meaningful black freedoms there, where there are plenty of other places where in Louisiana and elsewhere where if you don't have that, it's very much more difficult. I'm kind of leaning on here, especially Greg Downes' work, or he and Kate Mazza have done things with this, but Greg Downes together a helpful website with his book on mathematics called Mapping Occupation, and you can see a sort of visual of where the sort of troop presences shift over time and who's there, like whether you have black troops or not, whether you have cavalry or not, and being able to actually apprehend people or otherwise have a sort of calming effect is really important. But yeah, black troops are certainly very much opposed by many white Southerners, or see as a particular indignity to go with defeat. Some also complain that having black troops around, or even just having military around, encourages others to be idle, or this idea of formerly enslaved women and others like hanging around the camps and so on, and are getting in the way of needing to be contracting for work. So white Southerners especially have a number of complaints about black troops, but the military occupation is really sort of central to this sort of early sort of, I guess, pacifying the area after the Civil War.
So you do suggest with the, let me check here, 1874 elections that no one really is willing to consider that the only thing that really can change things and keep the country kind of moving in a democratic fashion and undermine some of this violence and ballot box stuffing and all these activities that undermine the democratic process would be a prolonged military occupation. But even the occupation we have is almost too small. Like, I mean, what could have done anything to improve the situation and make Reconstruction a success?
Yeah, it's really difficult in that certainly by the 1870s it is more or less a sort of skeleton occupation. We have at times, so Alexandria is the main town in central Louisiana, in Rapides, but there's an even smaller town over the river called Pineville, and that's typically where the military post was for some time. But that's there isn't any troop presence there from about 1879 to 73, and then it's very small for the next 4 years after that. It's one of the sort of the tragedies of this, that seemingly the thing required would be that sort of long-term occupation, and that's pretty unthinkable to 19th century Americans generally. Also, things that people like Andrew Langer have pointed out, that white soldiers are not necessarily reliable advocates of black freedoms either. And many are pretty reluctant to be doing this sort of occupation work. So it's extremely tricky. It kind of fits in with this sort of ongoing sort of urge towards sort of sectional reconciliation, like we're letting bygones be bygones after the war, and it's a really difficult situation by 1874 with some recession or economic depression as well. So it's you're facing a fairly sort of uphill challenge at that point. But it's something that's, as I said, really unfortunate about the seeing like the militarized aspect of how freedoms are enforced versus how difficult that is to contemplate doing a longer term.
Then let me ask another question on this, because we're sort of in the same mold. Because if you have a democracy that is only possible with troops present, that's not really a democracy, right? But then at the same time, if you have a democracy on paper where whites eliminates the African American voting population and stuff ballot boxes or have violence to preclude you from voting, that's not a democracy either.
Yeah, it's literally. I mean, it is it's a sort of toxic mix in Reconstruction, where like a good chunk of the white population doesn't see the Republican Party as legitimate, do not see black citizens as rightful voters or rightful citizens necessarily. So it is, it suggests like some of the the really toxic outcomes you can get from when you do have that breakdown of like political legitimacy, where if you don't just see your opponents as opponents, but also as like enemies and illegitimate. I think that's part of with the allegations against Republicans during Reconstruction in Louisiana. There's certainly I found my own reading and research like corruption is pretty pervasive in politics in the 19th century, certainly in the 19th century Louisiana. It's pretty bipartisan. Most of the politicians, or you get ample examples of politicians certainly enriching themselves to one level or another through this, or just being very much financially driven by how they behave. But I think in this context where there's so much challenge in even like acknowledging the end of slavery and coming to terms with the idea of like the full sort of humanness of formerly enslaved people, it's an extremely challenging situation. I think even in like the best of circumstances, this is like a really difficult shift from a society where a large proportion of the population is enslaved to one where they're free and then participating citizens in terms of like voting and holding political power. So it's, I mean, beyond just like waiting it out and hoping that the passage of time would improve things, I think it's one of the challenges of like making sense of Reconstruction and like its prospects. I think where there is a period, you look in Louisiana and elsewhere, you can see in the early 1870s, there are the moments and places where it seems like things are relatively stable, and you do get some white Southerners who decide that actually they're going to become Republicans and you get on with the situation they have there. So you do get a sense of like flexibility there. That's not always obvious from like the rhetoric you read, but at the same time, there are all these sort of challenges, like intellectual and other, to making this like a stable democracy, like one where the obstacle that Louisiana Republicans have in part is that they, if you lose a state election, it's effectively, if not an extinction level event for the party, it's certainly the case that they can be locked out of power at the state level essentially permanently. So then that creates all this incentives to never lose, which causes a whole separate crisis of legitimacy.
And you seem to have a lot of fears in Louisiana, and I'm kind of thinking, like you mentioned, like the fear of white individuals with regard to black troops, black militia units, even also the sitting of African Americans on juries. Like it seems like it's fear every time an African American appears in a position of some form of power, whether it is powers through arms or powers through involvement in constitutional processes.
Yeah, there's certainly, I say, a sort of very charitable reading of this would be a difficult adjustment. But certainly, many white Southerners are very reluctant to adapt. Even in courts, for instance, even the local bar gets in the way of when you have a majority black jury choosing to walk out the court rather than have cases go ahead as a way of trying to sort of, stop that functioning happening. And then I would say with it, I sort of tried to balance these things, but there are these real difficulties in adjusting and obvious fierce resistance among many to change and to adapt to changed circumstances. But there are also, you see hints of things that have shifted. So, for instance, in the early 1870s in Alexandria, there's a bar room run by a Bavarian immigrant, I believe, called Frederick Fluck, who caters to a multiracial clientele, mostly African American, but there's also this sort of German-speaking immigrant population as well tends to go there. And you see from trial testimony, essentially the local mayor, there are noise complaints at the place, and lots of the local white residents around there see this as being like uniquely threatening to morals and to society. But Fluke, after his bar is closed, he sues the city, gets a payment initially for this. But thanks to this, you get quite a lot of trial testimony talking partly from many white residents about how uniquely bad this area was for how bad the music was, how all the fights were particularly bad compared to other drinking establishments. But also that it's not a completely black and white thing, where you do have some interracial socializing there. Some of the people who are testifying, like this sort of immigrant group, at least others, they seem to be rather less fussed about it. Essentially, you get from that testimony, and even in that case, one of the, I can't remember, it's the mayor or someone else. If you're particularly interested, you can dig out the case. If you're eagle-eyed enough to look through the transcript of this. But I think the mayor who was involved in shutting down this bar admitted that even he had actually gone to the bar occasionally when he was sick and needed brandy. And once you unthread this a little bit, I think you see there's a little bit more flexibility than there might seem on the surface, and even going the other way as well. Like you get some African Americans who, for instance, one who's involved, I believe, in like schooling, a teacher, and initially active in Republican politics, seemingly like with transparent sort of financial motivations, becomes a Democratic traveling speaker for a while, and then becomes a Republican. And then later on, actually, several of the people involved with the Colfax massacre as like the Republican politicians in Colfax, people like William Phillips, who's a white Southerner, and William Ward, who was a black formerly enslaved, I think, likely formerly enslaved at least. So William Ward there, who had been Republicans, they moved to the Democratic Party in advance of the 1876 elections and start giving talks around the state about the truth about Colfax and how this is really part of this, essentially an effort to produce racial conflicts that will then provide the pretext to continue Republican power in the state. So it's what I see from like looking closer. I think is that there certainly are these real challenges in adapting and changing, but then there are these sort of hints of things changing that perhaps in imperfect circumstances or in other circumstances, like some version of this may have persisted. But I think you have to. I think looking at Reconstruction can bring out the pessimist in you, I think, as well. Although suddenly, the forces arrayed against that version of a more sort of stable, functioning multiracial democracy are clearly pretty formidable.
Well, you don't say. Reconstruction and bring out a pessimist. I think that will be the line of the interview. But the other part, and something I noticed with your book, and again, it's very common throughout Reconstruction scholarship, but looking at the Red River, and I already read Karen Peller-Sem's book on Reconstruction, which also deals with this area and violence in it, and it is phenomenal to my mind. Maybe not for you having read all of this material, but the level of comfort that the individuals have with all of this violence, that they don't blink when they commit murders, like it and it's sort of like how can you normalize something that gruesome?
It is certainly challenging. I think part of this, you do see it is a violent society. I think partly it's not exactly frontier, but it's relatively recently pushed out Native Americans and settled more fully with Rapides, for instance, being population growing through the 1830s, 40s, 50s. There's certainly this sort of honor-based culture as well, which plays out where from Rapides Parish there was there are still these sort of honor duels that come up. So if your honor is challenged, you could seek satisfaction by having a duel, and the person who kills the other has that being a defensible approach to settle a personal quarrel. And times in Reconstruction, you see these allegations. Actually, this isn't a political murder. This was a personal issue. And there are lots written about this in this British area. I think there certainly is likely something to do with like coarsening from war and slavery before, but some comfort with killing that way. I think it is an unusually violent part of the state. So there are various things going on there. I think in the northwest of the state, there's also the potential of when you're close to a state border, you might have that challenge of law enforcement that way as well with lawlessness. But it's certainly further up the river. I think I see sort of Rapides Parish, so that sort of centre of the state, as being the sort of gateway to this sort of self-consciously unvanquished bit of Louisiana, or bit that's especially resistant to change there. I think also there's less of that. Big in part, like if you don't have quite as much of a military occupation around, it's a little bit more remote. So if you are trying to send troops, it's a bit harder to get there. It's there's also the again something that Michael Fitzgerald has written about, this sort of shift to sharecropping and dominance of cotton agriculture. I think you are more vulnerable, or there's less of a sort of sense of potential collective security that you might have if you're still in that sort of gang labor style of work. So I think there are a couple of things factoring into it. In terms of Colfax specifically, which I think now, I think partly as well this sort of it does become life and death, but this sense of like existential crisis, or hugely significant struggle, or sense of that in like 1873 over this fight over offices, does kind of lead to this sort of violence there. But it's also it's something that why someone has struggled to justify. Like Biosat, for instance, initially talks about this being a sort of regrettable outcome, and only later that there are more sort of vocal efforts to sort of present the paramilitaries there as having being doing a noble purpose, and having essentially being these political prisoners. But it's interesting. I even wonder partly like where I see like this sort of raising of these fears around sort of sexualizing black political power, and seeing with black political power also a threat to white women. It's partly the fact that there are some very obvious, not just in Louisiana, but especially in Louisiana, there's a large free person of color population. This color line isn't static. So I think the fact that interracial intimacy is quite obvious. I suspect may lead to like some concerns there as well. Perhaps if this is like more closely realized, but this is I'm being a bit more speculative here. But there are a couple of things that go into it. I think the big part, it's a violent state, especially in the Northwest. I think there is a sense of the Confederacy having never fallen there as well, tying into it, and you also have, as you were talking about earlier, this sort of fairly close division of black and white populations, where the political incentive to carry out political violence is is present if you only need to sway some votes rather than a huge number. That's something that you might also be involved in.
Yeah, no, of course. And I'm thinking sort of like since violence obviously is a big part of sort of the demise of Reconstruction, but you point out two other factors that I think are important in sort of that conversation of how it eventually ends Reconstruction. And one of them is the sort of the unreliability of white allies that are within the Republican Party and working with African Americans at times, but towards the end kind of disappears. And you kind of already pointed to that a little bit with Colfax. But the other factors that I kind of thought was maybe interesting in that was that you have this inability when you have instances of murder, of violence, cause, personal harm, and they can't get convictions. They're taking these people to court. They can't get them convicted, or if there are convictions, like in the Cruikshank decision, right, that it's overturned eventually.
Yeah, it's certainly the Cruikshank decision. So this is the one that overturns the Colfax paramilitaries' convictions, where it was something like only 9-ish. Not very many of the people involved were eventually tried and convicted, but then immediately pushed up on appeal to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court certainly has a role to play in really sort of hamstringing what the federal government can do to enforce black voting rights and just rights to life here, where by really narrowing what the 14th Amendment can do, and in this case, you're narrowing what the enforcement acts can do. It suddenly becomes much more difficult to. It's not impossible to prosecute these cases, but you've got all these challenges. Like even with the Colfax cases, I'm fairly sure I write about this in this book about the concerns for the witnesses who are there. Where you might testify, and then there's the risk of being murdered when you come back. So there are plenty of reasons why you might be reluctant to talk about political violence there, and then overturning those convictions are really. It certainly, to be Ossat, coming back to him, this Democratic newspaper editor, he talks about, I think he talks about defanging the federal dragon, or words to that effect anyway, where he sees this as really being a key decision in sort of allowing sort of a return to what he'd consider self-government there. And that's a key part of it. Like later, like in the late 1870s, you do get these cases drawn to try and attack political violence, or to prosecute political violence, but you're having to thread a really difficult story where it's got to be connected to, I think, federal cases. And if you're thinking about federal elections rather than state ones, like how do you determine this? And then again, like the issue of just the jury pool, like it's not going to convict. Even at like state level, you see it is a story I track earlier in the book where you do get you get black membership on juries, which is an important step to like having a semblance of access to justice. But there are plenty of avenues where if the local community doesn't want a white defendant to face trial, you could not convict, of course, but also there are examples of breaking out of prison or out of jail, and otherwise various steps in the way where you get to just because you have an arrest doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a prosecution. So it is really challenging, again, like this sort of non-punishment of crime, and it's even one of the critiques, one of the arguments against Southern Republicans in the early 1870s is that they can't prosecute crime. This is often is presented as it depends on who you're viewing as the criminals who are not being prosecuted here, but it's an attack on Republican officials that they're not doing their jobs in enforcing law there as well. So you get tied in knots here, but it's a real a series of problems where partly the Supreme Court has a key role to play in undercutting what can be done. Partly there's this this national level reluctance to continue devoting troops to the south around elections because many of your allies in the south don't seem especially sympathetic, or because government is often a bit grimy, and some of it is pretty transactional. So there's a series of things that help to drive the eventual loss of state power in Louisiana.
So as a final question, because you have to run to pick kids up soon, we already said democracy eventually falls apart in Louisiana. African Americans lose their right to vote. They can't sit on juries anymore. Second-class citizenship. You also point out towards the end of the book that very little change in land ownership takes place in the course of Reconstruction, that most of the black landowners in Rabbit territories were owning prior to the war as well. So there's a trick question at the end. What did Reconstruction achieve?
I would say I think it's like a foothold economically. I think so. There are cases of formerly enslaved people managing to get land ownership, but yeah, certainly the more typical route is having been free before the Civil War, and then having land, or either having had land or then getting access to it afterwards. There's institution buildings, schooling. Rapides Parish is one of these centres of sort of black educational activism. You get these sort of other associations as well there. So it's sort of fraternal groups, that sort of thing. There's also sort of agrarian activism where you're getting involved in trying to collectively organise to get better conditions for African American farmers there as well. So there are gains. I think they are gradually reversed, not completely. I think, it certainly is one of these challenging things where I think like from like 1880 to 1900 or so in this area, you get there's some gains in land ownership, but it seems to be more or less proportional to the population growth there. So there's certainly stagnation at that point. But I don't think these changes from Reconstruction, although they might seem like small, when you step back, I think they're not fully reversed, and it's maybe a bit of a cop out to say like taking the long view here, but there are. I think part of how many white Southerners present Reconstruction as such a sort of scary and bad time is that it's an example of what might happen again, and certainly to white Southerners, or at least to most of them, they didn't see this as like inconsiderable change there. But yeah, certainly in terms of like money and wealth, I thought generally, Civil War and after, it's a time of economic hardship for many. But the wealthiest people tend to stay the wealthiest, or at least the families do. There's a bit of change, but it's not like turning the earth upside down in terms of land. And that's I would say it's more a sort of foothold rather than a sort of a major step towards that economic independence and or widespread economic independence during Reconstruction.
So semi-positive.
Semi-positive, exactly. There's positivity if you look hard, I think, or I think you can see positives from it, even in the face of this really challenging landscape, and even in harder conditions again in the 1880s and 1890s. This sort of activism and organising doesn't completely disappear, which again is maybe you see more an example of that institution building at that point rather than necessarily or recognising the limits of the situation that you're in.
Yeah. great ending for today. And since you have to run, so just as a final reminder, Fractured Freedom, Reconstruction in Central Louisiana by LSU Press. Beautiful cover, nice book. We have not touched on everything in it, so there's a lot left to discover in the book as well. So David, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Nils. I really appreciate it.